It was a late evening flight, the cabin lights were dimmed, and the soft hum of the engines echoed like a distant lullaby across the plain. The air felt heavy with the kind of stillness that only comes when people are halfway between their destination and the unknown, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of the overhead lights. Passengers sat in their seats, some half asleep, others too absorbed in their thoughts to even glance up at the flight attendants moving briskly up and down the aisles. Sarah adjusted the sleeve of her uniform and took a deep breath. She had done this 1,000 times before, walking through the aisles with practiced ease, making small talk with passengers, serving drinks and snacks with a smile, even when she felt exhausted from the long hours on her feet tonight. Though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different, there was a quiet weight in the air, a tension that made her glance more often than usual at the faces around her. Her eyes briefly scanned the rows as she walked past Mr. Jenkins sitting by the window, his grey hair neatly combed, his weathered hands gently resting on the armrests of his seat. She noticed the way he stared out at the night sky through the small oval window as if lost in thought, but his body was tense, his shoulders slightly hunched forward, as if trying to brace himself against some invisible force she couldn't help but notice. How frail he appeared, the thinness of his hands, the way his fingers trembled as he adjusted his position in his seat, and for a split second she thought to herself, he must be uncomfortable, but the thought passed quickly as she moved on to the next task. The flight was beginning to settle into its rhythm. Sarah moved down the aisles offering drinks to the passengers who were awake, but as she reached the back of the cabin, she noticed something that made her pause. Mr. Jenkins was still sitting there, his hands now clutching the armrests, a little tighter, his face still turned toward the window, but something in the way he held himself seemed off. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if his quiet presence was too still, almost too controlled. She walked past him again, this time a little slower, her eyes flicking toward him just for a moment, but she quickly looked away. She had a job to do, and there were more passengers to serve. Someone had asked for an extra pillow, and another needed a drink refill. Sarah tried to focus on these requests that seemed more pressing than the one quiet man at the window. Then Miss Jenkins raised his hand, his fingers weakly lifting from the armrest, trying to catch her eye. It wasn't a wave or a gesture to get her attention. It was something quieter, almost like a signal he needed help, but she was already halfway down the aisle and didn't stop. She told herself he probably just needed assistance with his seatbelt or something simple, but she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, something was wrong. Sarah finished up the drink cart and looked over her shoulder at Miss Jenkins. He was still there, still staring out the window, but now something in his posture had changed. He looked smaller, somehow like the weight of the world had pressed down on him, and his once steady grip on the armrest seemed to falter. His fingers now seemed to slip and tremble more than before. But the bell chimed, signaling the seatbelt sign to be turned on as the plane started its descent. Sarah quickly moved toward the front of the cabin, her thoughts lingering on the young family who needed help securing their child's seatbelt, a toddler who had become fussy during the flight. Sarah smiled as she helped the parents. She had trained herself to ignore distractions, to focus on the immediate task ahead. She told herself she would check on Miss Jenkins later, that everything was fine. He had only been a little uncomfortable, but nothing more. As the plane continued its descent, Sarah found herself scanning the cabin once again, her eyes briefly landing on Miss Jenkins' row. But this time, she felt something different, a tightness in her chest, an unease that she couldn't shake, the soft buzz of the overhead lights, the murmurs of the other passengers. It was all too quiet now, and she felt a wave of unease wash over her, but she pushed it aside and moved on, unaware of how much time had passed since she had last looked at him. Sarah's feet moved almost mechanically as she made her way down the aisle again, her thoughts briefly straying to the clock ticking away the minutes of the flight. She glanced at the passengers and smiled as she walked by, but it was harder to keep her focus than usual. The quiet hum of the engines seemed louder. Now the air felt thicker somehow, and she couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over her since passing Miss Jenkins earlier. The flight had entered its final phase. The descent was near, and yet Sarah found herself returning to Miss Jenkins' seat with every step she took. It wasn't as if he had made any more attempts to catch her attention. He sat there just as still as before, his eyes never leaving the window. But something about him now seemed different. It wasn't just the way he sat there. His hands had stopped trembling, but his face looked drawn, pale, almost ghostly. She tried to push the uneasy thought from her mind, but it wouldn't go away. There was a growing knot in her stomach that only seemed to tighten the more she glanced his way. She tried to distract herself by focusing on other passengers, but every time she turned her head, she found her eyes being pulled back to him like a magnet. She passed by him once again, this time her gaze lingering for a little longer. She noticed something that made her pause, just for a moment, the way his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, the subtle wheeze that accompanied each movement of air. He seemed to be struggling, but how could she have missed it earlier? Hadn't he been breathing fine when she passed by him before? Her stomach churned as she tried to brush it off. After all, she couldn't stop for everyone who seemed unwell on the flight. It was just a long trip, and maybe he was tired, maybe the altitude was getting to him, but still the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Sarah turned her focus to another row of passengers. As they asked for water or extra snacks, she smiled and nodded, but her mind was on Miss Jenkins. She felt her heart start to beat a little faster. The air around her seemed to thicken with an unspoken warning, like the plane had suddenly become too small for all of them. The flight was nearing its descent, and Sarah could hear the captain's voice crackling through the intercom, preparing the passengers for landing. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and she moved quickly to remind passengers to buckle up. Her hands moved efficiently, but her eyes kept flicking toward Miss Jenkins' seat as she walked past him again. This time he didn't appear to be looking out the window at all. His gaze was directed downwards, his hands resting in his lap, his breathing still shallow but more rapid than before. Sarah couldn't ignore it anymore. The feeling in her chest was growing too strong to ignore. She should have checked on him earlier, but she had been so caught up in the noise of the flight and the demands of others she hadn't even stopped to really look at him. But it was too late now. She couldn't afford to be distracted. There were still other things to do. The flight attendants had their routines, their duties to carry out. She wasn't trained to stop for every single person who seemed off. She quickly moved to assist a family with a crying baby. The toddler was unsettled, and Sarah's mind briefly left Miss Jenkins as she comforted the child, rocking back and forth, offering soft words of reassurance as the child finally settled down in his mother's arms. But as Sarah helped the family, she couldn't stop herself from glancing back at Miss Jenkins once more. He hadn't moved, but something was different now. His posture was slumped, and he seemed so incredibly still, too still, almost like a statue. His face was pale, his lips faintly tinged with a blue shade that made Sarah's stomach tighten with dread. Her feet moved before she even realized it. She found herself walking quickly toward his row, the knot in her stomach now a heavy weight pulling her forward. She stopped just before reaching him, but the sight before her made her blood run cold. His eyes were closed, his hands limp at his sides, his body too quiet. She reached out to touch his shoulder, calling out his name, but there was no response, just the steady hum of the engines in the background. Her breath hitched, and in that moment, the realization hit her like a punch in the gut. She had missed the signs earlier. She had ignored the quiet man who had needed help, and now it was too late to turn back. The silent guilt began to creep in. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her fingers hovering over Miss Jenkins' shoulder, unsure of what to do. The cabin was unnervingly quiet, except for the distant hum of the plane's engines. As her breath quickened, the air around her felt colder. Suddenly, She couldn't bring herself to touch him, yet something deep inside her told her that if she didn't act now, it might be too late. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she glanced quickly down the aisle for help, but no one seemed to notice the emergency unfolding in front of her. They were all caught up in their own little worlds, some chatting, some reading, and she realized just how alone they all were in that moment, how easily she had allowed herself to become distracted by the noise. She leaned down close to Miss Jenkins, trying to steady her nerves. She saw the faintest rise and fall of his chest, but it was too shallow, too irregular. A deep sense of dread settled over her, like a dark cloud. She felt it in the pit of her stomach as she reached out to touch his arm, this time her hand, shaking just slightly but still no response. Her eyes scanned his face. His lips were an unnatural shade of blue now, and his skin seemed too pale, his features too drawn. His frailty was so apparent, it almost felt like looking at a person who had slipped away into some distant space between life and death. Sarah's thoughts scrambled. What should she do? Was she overreacting? Was he just tired? Was there something she missed? She had seen signs earlier, but she had ignored them so easily. How had she not noticed how serious it had become? Why hadn't she taken the time to really look? She forced herself to take a deep breath, and her mind snapped into focus. It didn't matter if she was uncertain or scared right now. He needed help. She needed to do something before it was too late. She quickly pulled the call bell above his seat and waited for the faint chime to sound, but it seemed to echo in her ears with an unnerving slowness. The seconds dragged by in a way that made the cabin feel even quieter. She glanced down at Miss Jenkins' still face and tried to steady her breath. Her heart beat louder, now drowning out everything around her. Still no one came to her side. She stood there like a deer in headlights, waiting for the help that wasn't arriving fast enough. The seconds seemed to stretch into minutes, and panic began to edge into her chest. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to act. She grabbed the intercom and pressed the button, her voice shaky but firm, as she called out to the rest of the crew to help. She wasn't sure if it was enough, but she knew she had to do something, anything. A flight attendant appeared from the front of the cabin and rushed toward her, but by then Sarah was already kneeling beside Miss Jenkins' seat, desperately trying to assess his condition. She checked his pulse. As best as she could, it was faint, too faint, his breathing shallow and irregular. Her hands shook, but she tried to remain calm, her thoughts racing with the procedures she had been taught, but never had she imagined having to use them in such a situation. The other attendant arrived and immediately took over, checking Miss Jenkins' vitals. Sarah stepped back, but couldn't take her eyes off him. He looked so fragile, so helpless, and she realized just how much she had failed him. The guilt hit her like a wave, drowning her in a sea of regret. Her mind flashed back to the moments earlier, when she had seen him struggling, when she had passed by him thinking it was nothing, when she had ignored the soft, silent cry for help. Now it was too late to undo the damage, and the reality of it crushed her. The plane was descending, and now there was a sense of urgency to get the man off the flight safely, to get him medical attention. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it had been her negligence that had made this worse. She had missed the signs, the warning bells that had gone off in her mind, and now the weight of that realization pressed down on her. Her hands still shook, and her body felt heavy with the knowledge that this situation was spiraling out of her control. The other attendant moved quickly and called for the medical staff to meet them at the gate, but all Sarah could do was watch helplessly, her stomach tight with anxiety and regret. The minutes passed like hours, and by the time the plane finally touched down, Sarah was still standing there, frozen by the guilt of her inaction. The cabin erupted in the normal noise of landing, the sound of seatbelts unbuckling and people gathering their belongings, but Sarah remained silent, her thoughts only on Miss Jenkins. When the plane finally stopped and the doors opened, the other attendant helped Miss Jenkins off the plane, but Sarah remained behind. staring at the empty seat where he had once sat, and wondering how it had all gone so wrong. The plane had finally touched down, and the sudden rush of passengers gathering their belongings seemed to cut through the silence in Sarah's mind. But she couldn't shake the image of Miss Jenkins, his frail body, his pale face, his shallow breath. They wheeled him off the plane quickly. The medical staff had arrived just in time. But Sarah couldn't move. She remained frozen in place, staring at the empty seat where he had sat just hours ago. The seatbelt light flickered on again. But it didn't matter to her, not now. She couldn't care about the usual routine. Her hands still shook slightly as she slowly moved down the aisle, her mind replaying every moment of the flight, the way she had walked past him, the way she had seen him raise his hand weakly, and how she had ignored it over and over again. The faces of the other passengers seemed blurry, as if she were seeing through a fog. She heard the muffled voices of the crew, but their words felt distant. Unimportant. She couldn't focus on anything except the image of Miss Jenkins, slumped in his seat, his silent plea for help. She walked to the back of the plane toward the galley, trying to compose herself, but the weight of guilt pressed heavily on her chest. Each step felt like it took more effort than the last. She could barely breathe. The air feeling too thick, her thoughts spun in circles, her mind questioning everything about the way she had handled the situation. How could she have missed it? How could she have been so distracted by the louder voices, the more demanding passengers, when someone like Miss Jenkins had been suffering in silence right in front of her? A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. It was one of the other attendants who had been helping with the situation. She spoke gently, asking if Sarah was okay, if she needed a break. But Sarah couldn't answer, her mind still fixated on the moment she had walked past Miss Jenkins, and how she had failed to see the signs. The crew around her continued to prepare for the disembarkation, but Sarah's legs felt like they were made of lead. She couldn't bring herself to leave the plane. Not yet. She needed to know what happened to him. What was going to happen to him? Was he okay? Had the medical team been able to save him, or had it been too late? She stood there at the back of the plane for what felt like an eternity, until the captain's voice broke through the intercom, instructing everyone to prepare to exit. Sarah barely heard it. Her mind, still locked in the memory of Miss Jenkins, faced the expression that had haunted her since the moment she had first noticed him struggling. Finally, she gathered the courage to leave the plane, but as she walked down the jet bridge, her steps were slow and deliberate, as though she were walking through a fog of uncertainty. She had done this so many times before, walked out to greet the passengers with a smile and a sense of duty, but tonight was different. Tonight, the weight of what had happened clung to her like a heavy coat she couldn't take off. She stood at the gate watching the passengers file past her, most of them oblivious to what had just transpired behind them, their heads turned to their phones or their conversations, their lives continuing on as if nothing had changed. But for Sarah, everything had changed. The gate agents were busy checking tickets and giving directions for connecting flights, but she didn't feel like part of that world anymore, not after what had just happened. The thought of Miss Jenkins still lingered in her mind, his face still so clear in her thoughts. She walked to the employee lounge where the other flight attendants were already gathered talking about the usual things from the flight, but Sarah couldn't join in the conversation. She stood off to the side, staring at the floor, the weight in her chest growing heavier with every passing moment. Her colleagues noticed her silence. One of them finally asked if she was all right. Sarah shook her head and quietly told them what had happened. The words felt hollow as they left her mouth. They didn't seem real. She couldn't believe how careless she had been, how easily she had ignored the quiet man who needed help. Her mind raced back to that moment when she got past him, but when she had seen his hand raised and dismissed it as nothing but a tired gesture. How could she have been so blind? She felt a gentle hand on her shoulder, one of her colleagues, offering a comforting squeeze. But Sarah didn't feel comforted. She felt broken, like she had let someone down in the worst possible way. She had failed him. The door to the lounge opened, and a supervisor walked in, his face serious. He told them that the situation with Miss Jenkins had been critical, but the medical team was hopeful he had been stabilized for now. But Sarah barely heard his words. The relief she had expected didn't come instead. It was replaced with a deep pit of regret that gnawed at her. She had done what she could now, but she would never forget the feeling of walking past him, the feeling of ignoring his silent cry for help. The hours that followed felt like days. Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that she was being crushed by the weight of her own thoughts. Every movement felt mechanical, every breath forced, as though her body had forgotten how to function normally. She went through the motions of her usual routine, but her mind was always somewhere else, always back on the plane and Mr. Jenkins. She hadn't seen him after the flight had landed, and though she had been told he was in stable condition, the uncertainty still gnawed at her, the not knowing whether he would make it, the not knowing if her actions had contributed to the situation worsening. It wasn't until the next day, when Sarah got a call from the airline's medical department, that the heavy knot in her stomach twisted tighter. Her palms were clammy as she answered, and the voice on the other end was calm, but there was an underlying tension to it. "Miss Collins, we just wanted to inform you that Miss Jenkins is still in critical condition. He was admitted to the hospital shortly after landing, and while he's stable for now, we're still not sure about his prognosis." Sarah's heart sank as the words settled in her chest. She couldn't breathe for a moment as she heard the words echoing in her mind: critical condition, stable, but still uncertain. She had imagined a different outcome. She had convinced herself that maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed, but now reality was setting in with a brutal force. Her thoughts raced back to the flight, the moments she had passed him by without giving him the attention he needed. Her heart tightened with the guilt that she hadn't taken the signs more seriously, that she had been so focused on the louder requests, the more visible problems, that she had ignored the quiet plea from someone who needed help. The silence on the other end of the phone was deafening as Sarah struggled to find the right words, but there were none. She couldn't even apologize, because it felt too late for that, too hollow and empty. She had already missed her chance. As the days passed, Sarah tried to go about her work, but everything felt different. The cabin no longer felt like a place of routine. It felt like a reminder of her failure. Every smile she forced, every polite exchange with passengers, was just a mask to cover the turmoil churning inside her. The crew noticed her change in demeanor. They noticed how she no longer engaged in the usual chatter, how her eyes seemed distant, her movements more mechanical. One of her colleagues asked her one evening if she was okay, but Sarah only nodded and gave a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a few days later when she was asked to attend a meeting with her supervisor. The request came without warning, and it only added to the storm swirling in Sarah's mind. She walked into the small conference room, her feet heavy, as she sat down across from the supervisor, who sat with his hands folded in front of him. He began by thanking her for her professionalism during the flight, the way she had handled the situation with Miss Jenkins. He spoke in that calm, reassuring tone, but Sarah couldn't focus on his words. They felt like background noise as her mind raced. Then the conversation took a turn. The supervisor's tone shifted slightly as he asked her if she had noticed any signs during the flight, anything unusual about Miss Jenkins' behavior. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. The question felt like a sharp sting, like a reminder that she had failed to act. "Sarah, we've reviewed the footage from the cabin, and we noticed that you passed by Miss Jenkins several times without stopping to check on him. Do you remember anything about that?" The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She wanted to speak, to explain, but she couldn't. The guilt was too heavy to carry. She remembered each moment vividly, each time she had ignored him, each time she had told herself it was nothing to worry about, but now it all felt like an endless parade of mistakes. "I didn't think it was serious at first." She finally whispered the words, slipping out before she could stop them. "I didn't think. I thought he was just tired." The supervisor nodded slowly, and there was a long pause in the room. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on the table as she tried to steady her breathing, but the weight of the conversation felt suffocating. "We just wanted to make sure you're aware of the situation," he said quietly, "and we want you to know that we understand these things happen. But we also want to ensure that we're all doing everything we can to ensure passenger safety." Sarah nodded, her eyes still lowered. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. She couldn't bring herself to face the reality of what she had done. The meeting ended not long after, and Sarah left the room with a heavy heart, her mind clouded by a mix of shame and guilt. The rest of the day passed in a haze, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted forever, that she would never be the same after this. She found herself standing in the airport terminal later that evening, staring out at the planes lined up like waiting giants, and in the distance, she could almost see the outline of Miss Jenkins' face, the way he had looked so fragile and vulnerable, the way she had failed him. The weight of the silence around her was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the silence she felt inside. Sarah had never felt so disconnected from herself. She moved through the airport like a shadow, her body performing actions without her mind. Truly present, each step felt distant, as if she were watching herself from outside her own body. The weight of everything that had happened hung over her like a dark cloud that refused to lift. The days blurred together after that meeting with her supervisor. There were flights, of course, and the usual duties to attend to, but they all felt meaningless to Sarah each day. She stood in the cabin, she saw Miss Jenkins' face before her eyes, and it only made her feel more isolated, more trapped in the guilt that consumed her. On her days off, she stayed inside her apartment, as much as possible avoiding calls, avoiding texts, avoiding anything that might remind her of what she had done. She couldn't even bring herself to pick up her phone to check the updates on Miss Jenkins. She was afraid to know the truth, afraid of hearing that it was too late, that she had failed and beyond repair. One afternoon she found herself staring at the clock on the wall, each tick a reminder of the time slipping away. Her mind kept wandering back to the same thought over and over again. What if he had died? What if he was still hanging on because of her neglect? What if she could have saved him? The thought gnawed at her relentlessly, and each time she tried to distract herself, it felt like the walls were closing in more tightly around her. She tried to watch TV, but the voices on the screen sounded too far away to make any sense. She tried reading, but the words on the page blurred before her eyes. Finally, she couldn't take it any longer. She reached for her phone, trembling slightly as she unlocked it, and scrolled through the messages from the hospital staff. It had been a week since the flight, and the last update she had received was vague, still critical, still uncertain. Her finger hovered over the screen for a moment as she hesitated. Should she call the hospital? Should she risk finding out the news she wasn't sure she was ready for? But the thought of living in this limbo was unbearable. She needed to know. With a deep breath, she tapped the number for the hospital and waited, her heart pounding in her chest. As she listened to the ringing on the other end, she had no idea what she was going to hear. She could barely sit still, her body rigid with anxiety, until the line was finally answered. "Hello, this is the intensive care unit. How can I help you?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but she managed to speak the words that had been haunting her. "I'm calling about a patient, Miss Jenkins. He was brought in after the flight last week. Can you tell me how he's doing?" There was a pause on the other end before the nurse spoke again, her tone soft and professional, but there was a hint of something else there too, something Sarah couldn't place. "I'm sorry, but we can't give out specific details about a patient's condition over the phone. Could I take your name and pass a message along to his family?" The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her mind spun, and she opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her voice caught in her throat, and all she could do was nod before hanging up the phone with a sudden, trembling hand. The silence in the room was deafening. She had gotten no answers, no real sense of closure. She didn't even know if he had survived or not. She sat there, staring at the phone for what felt like hours, the guilt eating away at her. Every passing second, the shame growing inside her with every thought of what she should have done. That night Sarah couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, the weight of the darkness surrounding her making it impossible to find any peace. She tried closing her eyes, but every time she did, she saw Miss Jenkins' face again, the way he had looked so helpless, the way she had walked past him as if nothing was wrong. She had never been one to dwell on things before. She had always prided herself on being strong, but this time it was different. This time it felt like the weight of her actions might break her. She woke up the next morning with the same sense of dread still hanging over her. She couldn't escape it no matter where she went or what she did. The feeling of guilt was a constant companion. It was then that she realized that the hardest part of all wasn't the fear of losing him or not knowing what had happened. The hardest part was that she would never be able to undo what she had done. She could never go back and take back those moments when she had ignored him, when she had let the noise of the world drown out his silent cries for help. The only thing she could do now was live with the consequences. But how was she supposed to live with something like this? Her phone buzzed again, and for a moment, Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she reached for it. But this time it was different. It wasn't a hospital call. It wasn't even a message about the flight. It was a text from one of her colleagues. "Hey Sarah, we heard about Miss Jenkins. He's awake and stable now. Doctors say he's going to make a full recovery. Just wanted you to know." The relief hit her like a wave, but it was a strange relief, not the kind she had expected, not the kind she had hoped for, but the kind that came with knowing he was alive, that he had made it, but it still didn't take away the pain that she carried. The relief Sarah felt when she read the message about Miss Jenkins' recovery was fleeting. It didn't bring the peace she had hoped for. Instead, it opened up a floodgate of emotions she hadn't been prepared for. She stared at the words for what felt like an eternity. The knowledge that he was alive and well should have lifted some weight off her chest, but instead, it felt like a reminder of everything she had failed to do. She sat there in her apartment with the phone still in her hand, her fingers numb as she replayed the events of that flight in her mind, the way she had seen him struggling and had dismissed it, how she had walked away from someone who needed help. And now he was recovering, but what about her recovery? What about the part of her that felt broken? She couldn't stop thinking about the way he had looked, the way his hand had risen so weakly when he tried to get her attention, how in that moment she hadn't even thought twice to check on him. The guilt was still there, but it was slowly being replaced by something else, something sharper, the overwhelming need to make things right, to apologize to him, to find a way to take back the damage she had caused. But she knew deep down that there was no way to undo what had happened. There was no way to go back and change those moments. Her phone buzzed again, and she snapped out of her thoughts. It was a message from her colleague, the same one who had informed her about Miss Jenkins' recovery. "I think you should call him, Sarah, just to say you're sorry for what happened." The words hit Sarah like a slap across the face, and her stomach churned. She stared at the screen of her phone, her hands trembling again. Her colleague was right, of course, but the thought of calling him filled her with dread. What could she possibly say? How could she even begin to explain the guilt that she carried? Her fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of what to do. Should she reach out to him? Should she risk hearing his voice and knowing that her actions had caused him pain, that she had failed him at his most vulnerable moment? She stood up, pacing back and forth in her apartment, trying to make sense of everything. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more conflicting than the last. But there was one thing she couldn't escape, the realization that if she didn't make the call, she would never truly be able to forgive herself. The seconds stretched into minutes as Sarah fought with herself, torn between the desire to apologize and the fear that it would only make things worse. What if he hated her for what she had done? What if he didn't even remember her? What if he resented her for not helping when he needed it most? Her hand was shaking now, but she pressed the call button anyway, her heart thundering in her chest. As she waited for him to pick up the phone, she barely noticed the passing minutes, her breath shallow as she listened to the ringing, and then finally the click of the line connecting. "Hello." His voice was soft but clear, and it took Sarah a moment to find her words. She could hear the faintest crack in her own voice as she finally spoke. "Miss Jenkins, it's Sarah, the flight attendant from the flight last week. I wanted to say I'm so sorry I didn't help you when I should have. I was so focused on everything else that I didn't see how badly you were struggling, and I can't stop thinking about it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment Sarah thought he had hung up, or that maybe he hadn't heard her at all. But then she heard his voice again. "Sarah, it's okay," he said slowly, his tone calm, but there was something in it that made her heart ache. "I don't blame you for what happened. I know you were doing your best. I don't remember much from that day, to be honest, but I know you were trying to help me." Sarah felt a rush of emotions flood over her all at once. She wanted to cry. She wanted to scream. She wanted to say so much more, but she was stuck in the overwhelming sense of relief and guilt and confusion. "I was so scared, Miss Jenkins," she whispered, her voice trembling now. "I thought I might lose you, and I couldn't bear it, the thought that I could have saved you if I had just paid attention sooner." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentle. "Sarah, you didn't cause this," he said softly. "You didn't fail me. We all have moments where we miss things. It's not your fault." But it didn't feel like enough. It never would be enough, no matter how kind his words were. She knew that she would always carry the weight of that moment with her, the knowledge that she could have done more, that she should have done more. As the conversation ended, Sarah hung up the phone with a strange sense of finality. Something had shifted inside her, but it wasn't what she had expected. She felt a little lighter, but the burden of her actions still lingered. She didn't know what the future held, or if she would ever fully forgive herself, but in that moment, for the first time in days, she felt like she had taken a step toward healing, even if it was a small one. In the days that followed, Sarah felt a subtle shift within herself, as though a weight had been lifted, but also replaced by a lingering sense of unfinished business. She didn't know how to describe it exactly, but it was like a quiet undercurrent pulling at her heart and mind, reminding her that though Miss Jenkins had forgiven her, and though she had taken the step to apologize, she still had so much more to process. The guilt still lingered like a shadow. The flights continued as usual, and Sarah found herself moving through the motions once again, but everything felt different this time. Each interaction with a passenger carried a little more weight. Each routine check down the aisle was a reminder that life was fragile, and that every decision, however small, could have a greater impact than she had ever realized. One evening after a particularly long flight, Sarah sat in the crew lounge, exhausted, but unable to relax. Her mind kept drifting back to the conversation she had with Miss Jenkins. It had been a relief to hear his forgiveness, but it wasn't enough to erase the image of him in that seat, his fragile state, and the helplessness she had felt when she saw him raise his hand so weakly and yet still ignored. She stood up from the lounge chair and made her way to the window, looking out at the planes lined up on the tarmac. The hum of the airport was distant now, a soft buzz. Beneath the weight of her thoughts, the horizon in the distance seemed so peaceful, yet her mind was a storm, a constant reminder of the choices she had made and the consequences they carried. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out absently, expecting another message about the next flight or the usual updates. But when she unlocked it, she saw a message from a number she didn't recognize. "Hi, Sarah. This is Miss Jenkins. I just wanted to check in and make sure you're okay. I know we've both been through a lot, but I've been thinking about you and just wanted to make sure you're all right." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. It had been days since they spoke, and the kindness in his message took her by surprise. He hadn't just forgiven her, he had taken the time to check in on her after everything that had happened. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she typed and deleted several responses, before finally settling on a simple reply. "I'm doing better, thank you so much for checking in. That means more than you know." She hit send and then put her phone down, staring out at the tarmac again. Her emotions swirling inside her, she couldn't shake the sense that she hadn't truly let go of the past, and that it wasn't just Miss Jenkins' forgiveness she needed to find, but her own. The next few days passed slowly. Sarah found herself lost in her thoughts between flights, between the usual checks and routines. She kept thinking about the way Miss Jenkins had looked at her through the phone call, how he had so calmly reassured her. But it wasn't just the words that mattered, it was the fact that he didn't hold resentment toward her, even though she had failed him when he needed someone most. It was an hour before her next flight when Sarah received another call. This time it was from her supervisor, who told her that there had been a review of her previous flight, and the incident involving Miss Jenkins had been noted, but they had decided not to pursue any further action. They appreciated that she had apologized and showed initiative in addressing the situation, and while they understood that sometimes situations could be missed, they wanted to assure her that her actions on the job were still valued. The call ended, but Sarah didn't feel the relief she thought she had expected to feel, lighter, to know that the matter had been closed. But instead, she felt a strange emptiness, like she was waiting for something else to happen, waiting for the moment that would finally close the door on the guilt that had haunted her for so long. It wasn't until she was walking back through the terminal after another flight that it finally clicked for her. The closure she had been waiting for wasn't going to come from anyone else. It wasn't going to come from the hospital or her supervisor or even Miss Jenkins himself. It had to come from within her. She had already been forgiven, but the hardest part was forgiving herself, and that was the step she hadn't taken yet. It was the next morning when she sat alone in her apartment in the quiet light of dawn, and for the first time since that flight, she allowed herself to feel everything, all the guilt, all the shame, but also the relief that Miss Jenkins was okay, the kindness he had shown her, and the strength she had found in accepting that she was only human. She finally allowed herself to breathe deeply and let go of the weight she had been carrying all this time. It wouldn't be easy, and the memories of what happened would always stay with her, but Sarah had learned something important that day about forgiveness, about the consequences of her actions, and about the necessity of self-compassion. And in that moment, she finally felt at peace, knowing that sometimes the hardest person to forgive was herself.